I'm here with my guest, Inez Hedges and Victor Wallis. And they're a Somerville, long married Somerville couple and writers, very distinguished writers of different genres. But they're here to discuss their new books that are out. Miss Inez Hedges has the book Staging History from the Shoah to Palestine, three plays and essays on World War II and its aftermath. And she's retired from Northeastern, distinguished scholar. And her husband, Victor Wallis, who I guess I would characterize him more as a sociologist.
Political scientist.
Political scientist.
Yeah.
He has a new book out. I've interviewed him previously, Socialist Practice, History and Theories. Both of these books are put out by Macmillan. And let's see. I was going to ask you a first question. Where's my notes here? I'm sorry. First of all, I was going to ask you, how is it for you as a writing couple? I mean, how's it? Are you competitive? Do you help each other? I mean, maybe you can comment on that.
Well, I would say that we show each other everything before it's published and make editorial suggestions and occasionally suggestions of content, but usually just trying to make sure that what we're writing is saying what we mean.
Do you have any comments, Victor?
I think that's exactly right. I don't think it's a competitive situation. We don't write about exactly the same things, although it's complementary in the sense that we have compatible perspectives. So we really help each other editorially. It's a mutually supportive.
That's good.
Relationship.
You write your book, Staging History, and theatrical representations of things like the Shoah and the Israel occupation of Palestine are very valuable as an educational tool to teach people about these catastrophes that happen. Maybe you can, what has been your experience after staging these plays about the Holocaust?
Right. So I got interested in the Shoah in France because...
And for people who don't know about it.
So it's the deportation of over 76,000 Jews from French camps, especially one outside of Paris called Drancy. And after we got married more than 30 years ago, Victor's family is French. His family had to flee France. And so I found out about these deportations, which I think are not that well known. We know about Auschwitz, but we don't know about deportations from France to Auschwitz. And so I was reading up on this as a scholar of French culture. And one day I just sat down and wrote this play, which is basically a montage of voices from the German side, from the French side, from the children, letters from children who were in the camps without their parents. And it just coalesced, and the theater department decided to produce it. The French consulate got very interested and started sending people over to discuss it after the plays. And so it just snowballed from there and became a whole new area for me.
It seemed like, from what I was just reading about it, that different people get up and make a speech about something. It's sort of like Chekhovian, a slice of life, as opposed to a very straight, narrow,
Well, that's a very big compliment. Thank you very much, comparing me to Chekhov.
Why not? Why not?
But it is devastating in the sense that all these voices, which I assembled, they come together and they end with the deportation of the children. And the children and even the adults, they don't know where they're going. They say an unknown destination, wish me luck, we hope for the best. And of course, we know that there was no best, that everyone was annihilated. So it's a very devastating play. And after that, I tried to write plays that were a little bit more uplifting.
Okay. Now, was the audience, did the audience, you feel you taught the audience something, the audience reacted well to it and all that?
Right. Well, the play was part of a whole series of courses that we combined with the honors program and the theater program and the French department. So students were there to watch the plays, and then we had discussions afterwards. So it was part of a whole educational endeavor, definitely.
Now, I think a professor of sociology and women gender studies, City University of New York, said that your book, Socialist Practice, History and Theory, is wide-ranging, eloquent, accessible, and inspiring, requiring reading for Marxist, socialists, Black Lives Matter, etc., and anyone who hopes to avert the ecological capitalist catastrophe. That's not chopped liver, right? That's great.
Yeah, that's very generous.
Very generous. Now, that's what I ask you. You say that socialist practice, and I think I've discussed it with you before, is essential for the for addressing the ecological disaster. One would normally associate socialism, maybe just me, but would directly have that aligned with the ecological crisis. Maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, the basic link lies in the fact that the ecological crisis is a result of the infinite expansion agenda of capitalism. Capitalism has no obstacles or recognizes no barriers to its permanent expansion. That's its drive. So if you're going to stop the ecological crisis, or let's say slow it down, moderate it, you have to put brakes on this expansionist process. And really to put the brakes on a sufficient scale, you really have to change the whole basis of social and political decision making so that decisions are made on the basis of what is necessary to human well-being, but also to the natural infrastructure, and not decisions made on the basis of what allows for the greatest economic expansion, the greatest number of new products and inventions and sales and so on. So
you made the point that capitalism believes in infinite expansion,
yeah,
but we have a finite world. So
exactly. That's the basic contradiction, really, in one phrase. You can't have infinite expansion on a finite planet. And, many people have said this already, but somehow, when you get to these environmental global summits among governments, they meet and they talk, but nothing happens to stop the expansion. And so it means that they don't represent the interests of humanity as a whole or of the natural world, and the two are inextricable. I mean, you can't have a healthy humanity without having a healthy infrastructure.
Okay. Now, has any socialist country actually, is this, there are examples of socialist countries that have done what you've...
Well, the idea of restricting expansion is part of the principle of socialism. I would say there's no perfect example of this, but I would say, for example, interestingly enough, in the case of Cuba, when they lost the Soviet oil when the Soviet Union collapsed, they switched to largely organic agriculture, and it became a healthier agriculture. They've grown their forests, they've encouraged urban gardens. I mean, that's a very positive example. And even in the case of China, although they have not stopped the drive to expansion and competition, they've nonetheless put great emphasis on wide-ranging creation of solar panels, reforestation. And so there's some, let's say, what I would say is that there's the capacity within a socialist framework to make decisions on a different basis. Whether they'll do it or not remains to be seen. It's up to them having the necessary awareness and the necessary understanding of the natural processes involved, which include, above all, the restoration of biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, allowing the oceans to thrive in peace, not subjecting them to military sonar things and that type of thing, which the U.S. military is especially intent on doing, controlling the oceans. So it does involve a whole basic restructuring of social and political and economic priorities. And what I'm saying is that socialism is, let's say, a necessary but not sufficient condition for doing that. That you can't do it without socialism. Whether it will be done with socialism depends on how well attuned the population as a whole is to the need to do these things.
Thank you. And as you've written up plays about the Shoahs, we talked about the children of Drancy Street, is that correct?
Yes.
The Israel occupation of Palestine, Kafka in Palestine. And there's a school of thought that says that you really can't write about this stuff. It's too horrible and you would trivialize it. I mean, did you think about that at all?
Well, I think that, recently we've been through COVID and there have not been any productions, live productions of plays and live concerts, and people are really hungry for that connection that you get on stage so that you, as Brecht said, plays don't offer answers. They present questions for you to think about. And I think that's really important, that people really are hungry for interaction and community. And these plays always, you hope that there'll be discussions afterwards, which is always great. So that's, I'm an academic, so I don't write things just that are funny. They're meant to provoke thought.
But there is wit in them.
There is wit. Yeah, some of them have some really fun moments.
Even Beckett had a lot of wit.
Yes, he did.
Plays.
Yes, and he did.
A lot of vaudevillian stuff. Now, I don't know. I'm not, I know I teach in college, but I'm not an academic, creative writing. But you're saying that Marxism is being talked a lot about. And, I don't see it in my everyday life, from the general periodicals I read. I mean, is this just among academics and scholars? But you said Marxism is in the conversation now.
Well, it depends where you look in the society, but there's an openness to it, certainly among young people. Even for the last 10 years, surveys have shown that there's an openness to socialism, and people under 30 were equally favorable to capitalism and socialism 10 years ago already, despite all the unceasing barrage of anti-socialist propaganda. And certain sectors of society, when they become aware, those suffering from poverty, some of the more aware people in the prisons, for example, they're very interested in this, and they have a commitment to understanding it and to helping people to organize on the basis of a recognition of the structural changes that need to be made. That in order for to have a government that represents the needs of the people, it can't be the government that's speaking for the capitalist class. And so that's, even if you don't call it Marxism, and a lot of people, they won't necessarily use the term, if you recognize the class interest that dominates the society and you identify yourself with the struggle against it, that's part of what I would call the receptivity to Marxism, which certainly has increased. It's enjoyed a revival in the last 20 years.
Now, you wrote about the genre of the theater of cruelty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
in which the enactment of simulated violence sort of gives the audience a catharsis after viewing it. Have you seen? Have you used and seen this in your own play, that the audience might have had a sort of catharsis?
So I think that my second play was really too funny for that, because it was about two resistance.
You don't write funny plays.
Well, it wasn't completely funny, but it was about two resistance fighters who really flummoxed the Germans and were victorious. So two artists who lived on the Isle of Jersey, Claude Cahin and her mate, Suzanne Moore. So, but then the third play, Kafka in Palestine, I picked up where a lot of Israeli playwrights have gone, to try and tease out why there's such a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And I chose the couple of Franz Kafka and his sister through 100 years of their lives, and then later they come back as ghosts in the present, to tease out some of the ways in which the situation in Israel is quite Kafkaesque, actually. So it's, and I think there you have some theater of cruelty, because you have a judge who is unsympathetic to the Palestinian who wants to move back to his land, and so there I would say that it's not an optimistic play, because nobody can really look at that situation right now and be optimistic. But I hooked up with a lot of Israeli playwrights who have dealt with the similar topic. And I think it's really important, again, for the audiences to be able to see these conflicts, not find answers, but to look at the different sides and look at, points of view that maybe not be their own, and to consider them. So I think that's what my play is for.
Okay. Now, you have an interesting concept I read about. You said that believe that the oppressed in the capitalist machine, right? The oppressed are more knowledgeable about the oppressor than the oppressor is knowledgeable about the oppressed, and this hurts them both. Obviously, the oppressed are going to be oppressed, and the oppressor it divorces itself from, its people. So maybe, but how does that? Maybe give us an example.
The model of that really is the master and slave relationship, because the master doesn't know or care what's going on in the slave's mind, but the enslaved person has to be constantly alert to every nuance of what the master is doing in order to calculate. It's a matter of survival, a matter of life and death. So it's in that sense, and I'm saying if you transpose it onto the larger framework of modern day society, the policymakers in this country, they're very remote from the general population in terms of their concerns. I mean, I remember the scene of George H.W. Bush trying to check out at a supermarket counter, and he didn't know how to do it, that kind of thing. But the people who are oppressed, they're constantly reminded of the modus operandi of the system that's oppressing. And here again, the case of prisoners is a particularly striking example of this. They have to, as a matter of survival, as a practical matter, they have to recognize the sort of the different tones and shifts and nuances of the way they're being treated. And I think more generally that's true. But I think the other thing about the oppressor and oppressed thing that I wanted to bring out is that it's not only the oppressed that suffer, but it's also the oppressor. And the oppressor suffers in a human sense, in the sense that a whole sphere of humanity is cut off from the oppressor. There's a kind of alienation. And so it's humanly limiting. The oppressor is less of a fully developed human being because of not being in touch with the rest of humanity.
Interesting. Let's see. I was going to ask you both. I always ask opposites. Why should we read your book?
Why should you read? Oh, well, you shouldn't just read it. You should perform the plays. And bring them to the stage so that people can have those discussions after the play. There are 3 essays that go with the plays that talk about other playwrights who have dealt with these issues, and about theater that tries to change the world generally. So the general topic of theater that tries to make a difference in the world. So it's in a long line of other similar books by people who want to talk about the importance of the arts and theater, not just for theater majors but for the general public. It's a very healthy thing to have these things aired and brought out in the public.
In that regard, you must feel that your work is aligned with your husband's in some ways.
I think we're very much aligned. Maybe I could make a play out of Socialist Practice. That would be a challenge, but why not try?
Why not? please now pose the same question.
Well, my main concern and my main hope is that they will develop a massive popular movement that's aware of the scope of the danger and that is aware of the structural causes of it, what we talked about earlier. But for that to happen, there has to be some understanding of theory and history. And the understanding of theory and history, I'm not saying that it's the only thing that they need. There's a whole dimension of cultural expressions, practical interactions, organizing, and so on. But having an understanding of history and theory helps cement the organizing effort, gives people a deeper sense of their commitment, and is a kind of provides a framework for them to consider the practical questions that come up all the time.
Well, we have about 9 minutes, so if you want to read it, and one of you would like to read an excerpt from your book, would you?
What, do you want to read something, Victor? First?
Okay, very short.
I mean, I would say that the situation we face that Victor talks about in terms of ecology is a very dramatic situation. So it's rife with possibilities for drama.
Now, maybe I gave you an idea.
Maybe so.
We have limited time. I'll read just the
We
very
have 9
beginning.
minutes, yeah.
Very beginning and the very end,
Okay.
and then just say a word about what's in between. So at the beginning of the preface, this book complements my books Red-Green Revolution from 2018 and Democracy Denied from 2019. In Red-Green, I explore the politics and technology of eco-socialism, raising questions of political strategy in the context of planetary emergency. In Democracy Denied, I discuss obstacles to revolutionary transformation in the United States. The present work, while retaining the sense of urgency that drove its predecessors, steps back to examine the broad contours of recent history, while also going more deeply into certain particular struggles. So that's the overview. Then at the very end of the conclusion, and there's a whole vast range of topics that I covered in between that the reader will have to look for and get in touch with
Buy the book.
Yeah. Have to buy the book. Unfortunately, the capitalist publisher has set an exorbitantly high price. But I would encourage anyone who's interested and can't afford it to get in touch with me, and we can talk about how they can get at least parts of the book. So I want to read the very end about the solidarity that's required for the movement. Solidarity subsists as a largely suppressed value within capitalist society, but has shown its force in some of the exceptional moments we have looked at. Among production workers suddenly rising amidst revolutionary turmoil to the challenge of collective self-management, and among service workers from Cuba responding at often great distances, sometimes in emergencies, to support peoples whose needs for healthcare, education, disaster relief, or armed support outstripped what their own leaderships could provide. We know that individuals have the capacity to rise above the financial calculus imposed by capital. The question is whether they, or we, can create the political force that will be needed in order to generate such solidarity on a massive scale. Thank you.
Okay, so Victor and I are going to read a short passage from my most fun play, which is about Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, who defied the Germans on the Isle of Jersey, and they were condemned to death. But of course, we know that the Germans lost the war, so they were not killed. And the nice thing about writing plays is you can imagine encounters between people that probably never happened but could have. So we know that Claude Cahun was in prison, and she was under the surveillance of the Germans, and so Herman Baron, who's in charge of the civilian population of Jersey, comes in to see her. This is an imaginary thing, but he was aware of her and disapproved of her lesbian art. So I imagined a scene between the two of them. So Victor will read the Baron, and I will read Claude, who's in prison. So, and who might you be?
Baron von Aufsess. Here on the island, they just call me the Baron. I have the honor and also the duty to be the German civilian administrator for this island. I believe I can offer you and your sister a solution.
And what could that be? You know very well we are condemned to death. You are the jailers, we the jailed. But that situation will someday change, as well you know.
Yes, but in the meantime, we are still the masters. I find myself at a difficult position.
Oh, so now I am to advise you. Do go on.
Do not mistake me. I am not asking for anything for myself. I offer you a way to save yourselves only.
Possibly you wish to avoid the consequences of putting two ladies to death once the German occupiers are called to reckoning by the victors.
Perhaps also I am motivated by less selfish concerns.
Then you would be a most unusual person indeed. How are you going to convince me of it?
You refer to me as your jailer. However, now that France is in the hands of the Allies, we Germans too are in a sense imprisoned on this island.
Are you giving me a lesson in the ironies of fate? Permit me to laugh. Ha ha!
Some of the authorities here see this as a justification for harsher measures against the islanders. To prevent a full-scale revolt, I myself...
You want me to believe that you are one of the good Germans.
The military has its codes of honor. We cannot simply surrender. The situation is difficult. The government of Jersey is cut off from England, as we are cut off from supplies in France. Since the fall of Saint-Malo, we are entirely without provisions and resources.
So we are all chained to the rock, and I, as well as my sister, am simply to be tortured in eternity by the German eagle.
You compare yourself to Prometheus?
Ah, an educated German at last. So maybe we'll stop here. But she's very ironic and unreconciled and courageous, right? A smart aleck. And she actually did behave that way. So when they were condemned to death, they were condemned to be shot and to serve 9 months of forced labor. So they asked, are we to serve our forced labor before we are killed or after? So they were really wonderful, two wonderful ladies, and I just adore them.
It's obvious in your work. So we have a few seconds left. Again, Socialist Practice by Victor Wallis, and Staging History from the Shoah to Palestine, 3 plays and essays on World War II and its aftermath by Inez Hedges. And poet, writer,